let's get comfortable. Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today I feel like cases like this is why I even got into true crime in the first place. Just absolutely crazy. If you could hear my dog snoring, I apologize in advance. So today we're going to be talking about a man that killed 13 people just to prevent earthquakes. Let me repeat that again. He killed 13 people just to prevent earthquakes. That is absolutely crazy, am I right? I mean, we hear all kind of things, right? But to actually think that there is any way we could actually prevent Mother Nature from doing her thing, it is absolutely insane. Actually, there is facts that we cannot prevent earthquakes, but of course by preparing for them we could reduce the damage that they cause. But of course our guy had different plans. He actually thought that by killing these people he could intervene with Mother Nature. But of course, let's get to know him first a little bit before we get into details and what he did and why he did it. So his name was Herbert, and he was actually born in April 18 of 1947. He was born in Salinas, California, but he actually grew up near Santa Cruz. So Herbert had a very loving and caring family growing up. You could tell he had a pretty normal childhood. While he was in high school, he was the type to actually have many friends. He was actually very smart, and so by the time he was almost graduated, he was also voted most likely to succeed. But of course, it's life and nothing is perfect. So shortly after graduating high school, things took a turn for Herbert, and his best friend was actually killed in a car accident. So for Herbert, this was a pretty big change for his life. He was completely devastated. He struggled so much to get past losing his best friend and get past that grieving period, to the point where it said that he had a little memorial in his basement, and that was of course in honor of his best friend. But looking back at it, experts actually believe that losing his best friend was a big turn in this case, in the sense of they believe that Herbert, the fact that he lost his best friend, was actually what triggered in a very significant way his schizophrenia. So he lost his best friend. He was completely devastated. He felt lost. He was trying to deal with that grieving period. So soon after, at the age of 19, he turned to start doing marijuana and LSD, and that was the first time he tried those type of drugs. But he found himself later on not being able to stop, and so he became a regular user. But of course, our guide Herbert was not aware of his mental issues at the time, in the sense of he wasn't aware that he had a mental issue, so he didn't know how they were how the drugs would affect his mental health. And so little did he know, using those drugs would only make his schizophrenia way and way worse. And the family didn't start noticing any symptoms until he was at least 21. So after being aware of his schizophrenia and his family noticing symptoms and how he was reacting to the drugs and how bad he was getting little by little, he voluntarily entered a mental health facility, but he decided to leave the program after 6 weeks. In fact, he actually entered a few hospitals, in and out of course, and he even was supposed to show up for group therapy, but he never did. He never actually showed up to therapy, and he would always end up leaving the hospitals. In my opinion, it's almost like if in a way he was completely careless about his mental health and about like all the things that were happening to him, if that makes sense. He wasn't actually committed in getting better. At this point, he was not even taking his medication. And if you know you have a mental health and you're just in and out of hospitals, you're not even showing up to group therapy, like that says a lot about you and how much you like kind of taking care of yourself. So in my personal opinion, I feel like he was completely being careless about himself and of course his situation and everything that came with it. So of course, because he was not taking care of himself, he went from bad to worse. And that was the time that he actually thought of being honest about people around him. And that's when he started telling at least his co-workers that he was actually hearing voices. So he gets a little bit weird. He starts impersonating different personalities, if that makes sense. Like one day he was doing yoga, the next day he was a boxer, the third day he was the Mexican guy wearing a sombrero, the fourth day he decided to be a hippie. Obviously not in that order, but you kind of get the idea. It's almost as if he thought that changing his personalities was like changing a shirt, or like if that was even gonna solve anything at that point. But of course that didn't last him long, because that was not his solution, if that makes sense. Like, you changing personalities while having schizophrenia is not gonna be a permanent or even long-term solution. Sadly, by the age of 23, basically the truth came to light, because that's when he was diagnosed by actually 3 different doctors schizophrenic. So Herbert was not doing good. I mean, the drugs, skipping therapy, skipping his medication, like, how are you expecting to get better if you're not doing anything or like even working towards it? Of course you're gonna keep getting worse. So at some point it just got worse. Like, he was even putting cigarettes in his own skin, which is like something he's never done before. And even worse, he would start yelling at people who were not there. Now, of course, if you know what schizophrenia is, the disease that you would hear voices or see things that are not there. And so at that point, like, his disease was just getting worse and worse, because of course it was untreated. Like, he was not doing anything to get better. He was not looking for the support. He was not taking care of himself. He was just hurting himself, if anything. Per se, this is where his story begins and like his case starts, basically. So sadly or coincidentally, his birthday was during the anniversary of an earthquake that happened in San Francisco in the year 1806. But as you would understand, as his condition got worse, he began to basically tie his birthday and things that had happened to him to this devastating day. So basically our guy starts relating his birthday to this very deadly day. There was this mathematician that predicted that there was going to be another earthquake in San Andreas in the year of 1972. And because of this information, that was like the last piece he needed to connect his birthday to like earthquake stuff. You know, like when you have a weird thought and you just need like that one last piece of confirmation. That was this like one last piece of confirmation for him. This was the last piece that told him like, hey, you're right. Now there's 2 of us telling the story. So of course, with the confirmation that he needed to confirm his theory about how his birthday was related to earthquakes and his very untreated disease, he passes by a homeless guy. Of course, the street was like very quiet. There was barely any lighting, and what easier target can you ever think of? So he pulls over and opens the hood of his car, pretending like he's having any type of like car issues or so. Or of course, at least that was the goal, to pretend that he was like his car was having any issues. So of course the poor man didn't know what he was walking himself into. So he offered his help. But you're a homeless person. You see somebody having issues. You think you're doing the right thing, but you don't really know what you're walking into. So as he got closer to the car, Herbert actually hit him with a baseball bat to death. Like, out of all the ways you could kill somebody, Herbert actually killed this poor homeless guy, beating him to death. Nobody paid much attention, and the body of this homeless guy was not found until a couple of days later. What is interesting in that in Herbert's mind, he believes that Jonah from the Bible actually telepathically communicated with him and asked him to kill this homeless person so that others people would be safe. Of course, we know the story is not just gonna end there. Like, he's not just gonna kill one person. So his second victim, her name was Mary, and she was actually a college student. So Mary was hiking on October 24th until she came across with Herbert, who actually stabbed her to death. He was so mentally sick with just his second victim. Like, it was such a big jump from just beating someone to actually stabbing someone. And not just that, he even took the time, besides stabbing her, he took out the time to open her and take out all of his organs. Like, you have to be not just telepathically communicating with someone for you to open up a body and actually take out all of the organs. Like, how sick do you have to be? The part that it gets even sadder is that the girl was not found until February of the following year. You know, it's pretty hard to lose somebody you love, but it's even harder not having that closure of knowing what actually happened to them, which is what happened with Mary's family. They didn't get that closure until almost like a year after of what actually happened to her and where her body even was. Like, it's one thing to think that your family member is missing, and it's a whole another thing that they're dead. And especially when it's just like a college student, obviously full of life, full of a future, trying to do better for herself and like for her family, basically trying to build her own destiny. But if there's anything positive out of this, is that there's so many cold cases where bodies have never even been found until the family doesn't have that closure. At least with Mary, they found her even if it was like a year later. So switching gear, our little messed up friend strolled into Los Gatos Catholic Church. So he went in as a confession, but then later on he believes that the father was actually volunteering to sacrifice himself. So after he stabbed Father Henry, he actually fled the scene. So basically, after believing that Father Henry had voluntarily offered himself, basically, he fled the scene and he left him bleed to death. He was not only killing these people, he was evolving as a killer. Whether he was getting more confident, whether he was just scared, whether it was really his voices, or whether deep down in himself, any part of this make him feel better. He was evolving. Or maybe, if you really think of it, he was deteriorating. Who really knows? But more people were getting hurt. Like, the time frame of his killings was just getting shorter and shorter, if that makes sense. Which is really dangerous considering that he had mental issues. So like I said, he was evolving for better or worse. So actually in January 25th of 1973, he killed 5 people in just one day. 5 people at once. So no earthquake had come to California during that time. So he actually was believing that he was the one preventing those earthquakes. That the reason that there was no earthquake at the time was because he was killing these people. And that he was the reason that these disasters were being kept away. So at that point, Herbert actually killed his whole friend and that friend's wife as well. So at this point, his body count was at 8 people. He had actually only killed 8 people, and that's when he decided to go on a campsite. What's bad about this campsite is that he actually killed 4 people at once. They were teenagers. So he killed 4 teenagers at once. So in his mind, he believed that he was, again, telepathically communicating with them and that they had actually given him permission to murder them. It's really sad, the teenager part, not only because they were so full of life, they had so much to live for, but the fact that they had actually kind souls. They actually invited him into the campsite, and this was what they got back. They were trying to be kind, and in return they got killed. So their bodies was not found until like a week later, and by then Herbert had already killed again. It's like I said, this guy was really evolving, at least in his head. Like, it was just like in such a small amount, in such a short amount of time, he was just killing so many people. Whether he was evolving or deteriorating, it was just becoming really bad. On February 13th, there was this guy named Fred Perez who was actually working in his driveway. So he was working in Herbert's driveway, and Herbert actually shot him and killed him. Thankfully not because he killed other people, but thankfully because this was the first time that he actually had a witness. His neighbor actually saw him. So this was the first time that anybody had seen Herbert actually murder someone or even suspected of him. And later on, Herbert was actually arrested within the area. Herbert was actually found guilty of 10 of the 13 murders he committed, and weirdly enough, he actually pleaded guilty to all of them. So because he pled guilty to all of them, it was only the question of whether he was actually sane or not. So obviously, if you have any type of mental issues, you're not going to be charged of somebody who is just willingly committing these murders. So that's where it got a little bit complicated in Herbert's case. He was obviously schizophrenic, so the question was whether he intentionally committed these murders or if it was just more of like mental issues itself. So basically, the judge's job was to determine whether or not he was basically responsible for all of these crimes. So when Herbert was in custody, he tried to represent himself. Obviously, the judge decided that he was not mentally competent in any sense of the word to represent himself. He even tried to fire his public attorney a couple of times with the goal of course, representing himself. But of course, considering the circumstances, the judge didn't allow it. So during the trial, Herbert spoke pretty much about his voices and what he had been hearing for many years. He basically said that the voices were the one telling him that he had to kill, and he referred to them as what he called die song. Despite all of this, the prosecutors found evidence against Herbert, which pretty much implied premeditation to all of his crimes, which suggests that our guy Herbert was pretty much sane while committing all of these murders. And because of this, he was convicted of all 10 murders. So at this point, he was convicted of 2 murders in the first degree, and he was convicted of 8 in the second, because the other 8 were a little bit more impulsive rather than him planning it out, basically. Herbert was pretty much sentenced to life in prison, and he is currently incarcerated in Mole Creek. But being honest, his trial was also a little bit strange, as well his police investigation. So basically, while he was being interrogated, he yelled silence pretty loud and just got worse from there. He also weirdly claimed that people should be very thankful that he killed all of those people and that he had the state of California safe from earthquakes thanks to those deaths. During his case, like at the very end, it was revealed that he, like, basically he told police officers about like his actual voices, and at some point he even confessed that he heard his own father's voice telling him to kill. He basically just like explained the trajectory of all the voices he'd been hearing for over the years since he lost his best friend, most likely. And then he later on explained how the voices are relevant to his case, which is because he confessed that the voices were the ones telling him to like murder these people, and like how to do it, and how they were giving him permission, or like acting as like Bible characters to give him permission to like actually sacrifice themselves to his case. During his time in jail, he also spent a lot of time writing all of his twisted ideas. Some of the highlights of his trial was in the very beginning of the trial, when he basically plead non-guilty because of insanity, most likely. So his lawyer was telling the court about all of Herbert's crazy or creative ideas, such as like when his family conspired to hide his bisexuality. So his family at some point tried to hide his sexuality from him. That occurred, of course, while he was a child. And of course, because all of this occurred at the age of like 6, it's like, who tells a kid that is 6-year-old try to hide bisexuality from him and basically tell him like you should have the pleasure of having orgasms? Of course, he was very smart to play that card because he knew it was gonna help his case, or at least he thought in like a way or two that it would help him. So later on in his case, or during the trial, Herbert actually decided to stand up for himself, which is actually something that people didn't think it was even going to happen during this trial. He actually decided to take the stand, and he basically preached in his own defense. He also explained to the courtroom about how his birthday was related to Einstein's death as well. He basically connecting his death to so many important dates. He claimed that he was destined to be the leader of his generation. Like, clearly the guy met all the possible connections to justify what he had done, and to like basically justify his case, if that makes sense. Like, he was the type of person to basically have an answer for all of the questions, or at least like in his messed up mind he thought like he had answer for like everything, all of his questions, and like justifying all of his actions and like things and decisions that he had done. Basically just like looking and like finding reasons and like why he was right. So over the year he tried to get out on parole many times. Obviously that was not possible, but despite everything that happened when Herbert was actually once again eligible on parole in 2020. So as of 2021, Herbert is still pretty much alive, and he is serving in a mental facility. In my personal opinion, this is kind of like a sad case, not only for Herbert, but especially for all of his victims. Like, there were so many people that didn't have to die because of all of his craziness. And it's sad for him because he was kind of like the person to not take care of himself. He didn't care of his mental health. He didn't care of taking his medication. He basically was careless about himself. He never even showed up to like group therapy. And you know, part of having a mental health issue is having also the motivation, or at least like trying to do better for yourself, which was not the case for him. And obviously so many other people had to pay the consequences for all of his actions.